know the Cold War started in Fulton, Missouri? All right, let me explain. In March 1946, Winston Churchill, fresh off of winning World War II, was in town to get an honorary degree from a small college. He gives an acceptance speech, and then in the middle of it, drops one of the most infamous lines in modern history.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Back in Moscow, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, a man not exactly known for staying chill, reads this. In substance, Mr. Churchill now stands in the position of a firebrand of war, which in 1940 speak is basically calling him a warmongering Hitler wannabe. And just like that, the Cold War was on. For the next 45 years, these two rhetorical shots would define everything. This was the Cold War, a global struggle between two irreconcilable ideologies. The Soviet Union and its communist allies wanted to expand their roster of governments. The West, led by the United States, had a one-word policy: containment. That's it. Just keep the red blob on the map from getting any blobbier. This battle was fought in 5 main theaters: Europe, Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and the Americas. It was fought diplomatically, economically, with science, and secretly with spies, counter-spies, coups and counter-coups. And hanging over every single decision, every chess move, was the one horrifying risk. That one tiny miscalculation could unleash a storm of nuclear weapons so massive it could kill every human on the planet. So, how did we get here? How did two allies who just beat the Nazis together immediately turn on each other? Our story really begins just before the end of World War II. It's February 1945. The Big Three, as they were called, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, meet at Yalta in Crimea. They're allies. They're buds. Well, kinda. I mean, they don't hang out on weekends or anything like that. They meet to draw up the rules for the post-war world. They sign the Yalta Conference documents, which call for a liberated Europe, where every nation is free to democratically determine its own destiny. Sounds great, right? Yeah, about that. Even before the shooting had stopped, the Soviet Union was playing by a very different set of rules. In the countries it had liberated from the Nazis, the USSR took measures to ensure communist rule. Weeks before Germany surrendered, the Soviets imprisoned and later executed non-communist Polish leaders. In Romania, Soviet troops provided the muscle to establish a communist dictatorship. To Stalin, he was strengthening the Soviets' border with Western Europe, from which they were invaded twice in the 2 most violent wars in history. That messaging resounded well with a Russian population that barely survived World Wars I and II. Stalin had literally just underwritten the principle of democratic self-determination at Yalta, and he was already subverting it all over Eastern Europe. America's response was not subtle. First, the economic sledgehammer. In 1947, the US proposed the Marshall Plan. The US offers billions of dollars, over $13 billion to be exact, to finance Europe's recovery. By the way, that's $173 billion in today's money. But here's the catch. The USSR sees this as America just buying friends. So, Stalin forbids any of the Eastern European countries behind the Iron Curtain from taking a single cent. Next, the diplomatic response. This is the big one. Get this tattooed on your brain. In 1947, career diplomat George F. Kennan wrote the memo. He argues the main element of US policy, quote, must be that of long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. You hear that word, containment? That's the word. In fact, that's the whole game. Now, Kennan said in an interview decades later that he intended containment as a diplomatic policy, but his successors in DC basically said, "Great idea, George. Now let's add a military component." In short order, containment morphed into rollback, the idea of eventually ousting the Soviets from the countries they seized. This policy would govern US-Soviet relations for the next 40 years. This fit perfectly with the new Truman Doctrine. As communist guerrillas were hammering Greece and Turkey, President Harry Truman told Congress, quote, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation." Congress was persuaded. They sent $400 million in aid. That's over $6 billion today. Why? Because of a brand new fear, a domino effect. The fear was that if Greece and Turkey fell, the rest of Europe, the Middle East, Iran, and North Africa would all follow. The first real showdown happens in Germany. In June 1948, the Soviets decided to test that US resolve. They stopped all highway traffic from Western Germany through Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany to Berlin. This was a siege. Berlin was cut off. Stalin was trying to starve the entire city, American, British, and French sectors included, to bring it under Soviet control. America's response? They thwarted the siege with an airlift, the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, US and Allied planes flew 24/7, landing in Berlin every few minutes, bringing food, medicine, and fuel. It was a logistical miracle and a massive PR win. The Soviets finally relented. This provocation scared the hell out of Western Europe. They realized they needed a "you and what army" pact. In 1949, 10 European countries, plus the United States and Canada, formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The signers promised that an attack on one of them was an attack on all of them. 6 years later, the USSR formed its own rival alliance with its Eastern European satellites, the Warsaw Pact. Now, NATO and the Warsaw Pact would never come directly to blows, but the Warsaw Pact was formidable enough to give the USSR the freedom to be as repressive as it wished behind the Iron Curtain. In Hungary, in the mid-50s, the government started to reform. They gave up control of the press and promoted public discussion. In October 1956, Hungarians rose up and demanded Soviet troops leave. Their leader, Premier Nagy, announced Hungary was withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact. Big mistake. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sent the Soviet army to crush the revolt. Thousands of Hungarians lost their lives. Many more fled. Soviet agents kidnapped Premier Nagy. Khrushchev had him executed in 1958. That same year, Khrushchev initiated a second Berlin crisis, telling the Allies to get their armed forces out of the city. They rejected his ultimatum. You see, the East German government, or the GDR, needed control of Berlin. Why? Because East Germans could just walk into Western Berlin and from there travel to West Germany. Between 1949 and 1961, some 2.5 million East Germans fled to the West. This was a serious drain on their economy and a massive political embarrassment. So, what was their solution? The Berlin Wall. Overnight, on August 12, 1961, the East Germans closed the border. They dug up streets. They strung barbed wire. An armed policeman was posted every 6 feet.
Herr Vorsitzender, bedeutet die Bildung einer freien Stadt Ihrer Meinung nach, dass die Staatsgrenze am Brandenburger Tor errichtet wird?
Ich verstehe Ihre Frage so, dass es Menschen in Westdeutschland gibt, die wünschen, dass wir die Bauarbeiter der Hauptstadt der DDR mobilisieren, um eine Mauer aufzurichten. Ja? Mir ist nicht bekannt, dass solche Absicht besteht, dass sich die Bauarbeiter in der Hauptstadt hauptsächlich mit Wohnungsbau beschäftigen und ihre Arbeitskraft dafür voll ausgenutzt wird, voll eingesetzt wird. Niemand hat die Absicht, eine Mauer zu errichten.
Eventually, a block wall lined the boundary, flanked by a no-man's land. The GDR called this barrier the most visible symbol of Soviet repression, the, quote, anti-fascist protection wall. West Germans just called it the Wall of Shame. Czechoslovakians didn't fare any better. In January 1968, a reformer named Alexander Dubček began working toward what he called, quote, socialism with a human face. He proclaimed freedom of the press, freedom to travel. This, quote, Prague Spring, as it was called, ended on August 20th. Leonid Brezhnev, Khrushchev's successor, sent in the tanks. Dubček ordered his forces not to resist, so there was little bloodshed. But Czechoslovakia came under the heel of one of the most repressive regimes in the entire Eastern Bloc. In Europe, the lines were drawn, but in Asia, there was no NATO. And this is where the Cold War got hot. In Vietnam, shooting started in 1946. The French, driven out by the Japanese in World War II, returned to their former colony. But an alliance of nationalists and communists called the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, had already occupied Hanoi and wanted their country back. The Viet Minh were ultimately supported by the Soviet Union and China, which became a communist state in 1949. So Vietnam was simmering. But Korea boiled over. The Soviet Union and the US had partitioned Korea after World War II. Soviet influence in the north, US interest in the south. Talks to reunify failed, partly because the US feared the communists might win an election, and partly because the USSR balked at including the, well, reactionary government of South Korean strongman Syngman Rhee. North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung wanted to take South Korea by force. But to do that, he needed support from Stalin. And Stalin gave him the green light. On June 25, 1950, divisions of the North Korean People's Army stormed across the 38th parallel. They took the South completely by surprise. The UN Security Council convened, and here, the US got some big-time luck. The Soviet Union? It wasn't there. They were boycotting the UN for not admitting communist China. With no Soviet delegate to veto the motion, the Security Council voted to send military assistance to South Korea. General Douglas MacArthur led the UN forces. At first, they were easily pushed south, but then MacArthur, in a massive stroke of boldness and riskiness, launched an amphibious assault 150 miles behind enemy lines at Incheon. It was a spectacular success. The North Koreans were cut off. Their offensive became a retreat. Days later, MacArthur had liberated Seoul. But they didn't stop. When UN forces reached the 38th parallel, they continued north, surging up the coast toward the Yalu River, which was the Chinese border. Unwilling to have a pro-West Korea as a neighbor, Chinese leader Mao Zedong sent his army into the fray. By January 1951, the Chinese had pushed UN forces south of Seoul again. The advance stalled. By late March, they were right back at the 38th parallel, exactly where they started. And that's where the stalemate would persist, even to this day. Containment had technically thwarted communism's spread into South Korea, but over the next quarter century, that same policy would fail in Vietnam. But let's move on to the Middle East. The founding of Israel in 1948 became the new focal point. America's unwavering support for Israel gave Arab governments who wanted to undo Israel little alternative but to seek financial and military help from the Soviet Union. This got really weird during the Suez Crisis. Egypt's President Nasser moved closer to the Soviets, so Britain and the US withdrew their promise of financial aid for his huge project, the Aswan Dam. In response, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. This provoked an attack by France and Britain, who had old imperial claims to the canal, and Israel. And get this, the US diplomatically intervened to stop its own allies. This whole episode just pushed Egypt and the Soviet Union, who, by the way, ultimately financed the Aswan Dam, even closer. But for the US, the real red line was in its own hemisphere. Since the 1800s, the Monroe Doctrine basically said, no distant powers meddling in the Americas. During the Cold War, leftist governments in Guatemala, Chile, and Cuba became targets. In Guatemala and Chile, the US dealt with communist inroads by, well, fomenting successful coups against their leftist leaders, even though both had been elected. But Cuba was more complex. In 1959, Fidel Castro forced out corrupt US-backed strongman Fulgencio Batista. A year later, Castro's communist leanings were clear. He signed a trade agreement with the USSR and started nationalizing US investments. A communist state, 90 miles from Florida, intolerable. The CIA began training Cuban exiles to spark a popular uprising. In April 1961, under the new president John F. Kennedy, the invasion began. The Bay of Pigs, as it was called, was a disaster. Kennedy refused to permit US forces to take part. There was no popular uprising. The rebels surrendered to Castro's Soviet-supplied tanks after 3 days. It was total humiliation. And 18 months later, the full measure of Cuba's threat became clear. Spy plane photographs revealed the construction of missile sites in Cuba, Soviet missiles, nuclear warheads that could land in the US with almost no warning. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, why did Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev do this? He was responding to the US installing missiles in Turkey right on the USSR's border. The US countered, demanding the missiles be removed and calling for a naval blockade of Cuba. For 2 weeks, the world seemed on the brink of a nuclear holocaust. Kennedy prepared to bomb the sites. Khrushchev threatened to retaliate. Fortunately, they worked it out. Khrushchev withdrew his missiles from Cuba. In a secret deal, Kennedy pulled the US weapons from Turkey. The world could exhale. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we came to ending the Cold War, but the game continued. The Soviets chased the US in nuclear tech. The US played catch-up in the space race after the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, the first artificial satellite ever sent into space. And then they sent the first human into space 4 years later. In 1969, the US and Soviet Union, they actually tried to relax. It was called détente. President Nixon and Premier Brezhnev signed SALT I, limiting intercontinental missiles. President Carter and Brezhnev signed SALT II in 1979 to reduce them. Less than 6 months later, Carter asked Congress to delay ratification. Détente was dead. Why? The USSR had backed a 1973 Syrian-Egyptian attack on Israel. They'd supported communist takeovers in Angola and Ethiopia. And in December 1979, the Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan. President Ronald Reagan condemned the USSR, labeling it the, quote, evil empire. He steadily increased the US military budget and initiated the Star Wars Strategic Defensive Initiative, a shield in space that was planned to be built to protect against Soviet missiles. And this is what finally broke the bank. The cost of the arms race was crippling to the USSR. They were devoting 25% of their entire economy to the military, compared to about 6% in the US. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union. He was determined to change things. He introduced perestroika, or restructuring of the political and economic system. He introduced free markets, freedom of expression flourished. He signed arms reduction treaties with Reagan. He promised withdrawal from Afghanistan. But most importantly, this process of perestroika extended to the costly support of all those inefficient, unpopular dictatorships in Eastern Europe. Gorbachev encouraged reform. However, it was too late. In Poland, the Solidarity Trade Union was permitted to participate in a June 1989 election. It won in a landslide. 2 months later, Poland had its first elected government in 40 years. Pace of change became dizzying. By the end of the year, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria had all pulled themselves from Soviet domination. West and East Germany reunited. In November 1990, the US, Soviet Union, and 30 other nations signed the Charter of Paris, which proclaimed the Cold War had ended. And then, in a 1991 postscript, all the republics of the USSR, Ukraine, Armenia, Belarus, and all the others, gained their independence. The Soviet Union itself was dissolved. The Cold War was over. It had been costly in lives and resources that could have been spent building stronger economies. But it also freed millions of people from totalitarian regimes and completely redefined the shape of geopolitics for the 21st century. Democracy had prevailed. The Cold War was so massive we couldn't fit it all in this video. What's another Cold War event that you think more people should know about? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.